Welcome to Vermont Artists and Authors, where we interview great storytellers and artists from the amazing Green Mountain State. This is episode 37. I'm your host, Barney Smith of storycomic.com, and we're excited to have with us the acclaimed author, Jane Dwinell. Jane.
Hi.
How you doing?
I'm okay, and you?
So Jane, before you just came out with a book that that really focuses on it's called Alzheimer's Canyon: One Couple's Reflections on Living with Dementia. Would you consider this a memoir or more of a handbook, or how would you kind of catalog this?
It's more of a memoir, and actually I'm the co-author. My husband, Sky Yardley, wrote most of it. He had dementia. He was diagnosed in 2016 with probable early stage Alzheimer's, because of course they don't know until you die and they do an autopsy, but that's what we went with. And Sky he amazingly embraced this. I mean, he was devastated and sad and cried for every day for like 2 months, but he embraced that he had this diagnosis and he was going to find out everything he could about it. He wanted to find his people, other people with dementia. And he did a lot of public speaking. We both did. And then he started writing, and he wrote and he wrote and he wrote. And we started a blog, and he wrote as long as he could. He wrote until a little more than a year before he died. And he was still writing when he couldn't dress himself or bathe himself or feed himself. Right. But he was still writing. And after he died in 2021, I compiled everything and found a publisher, and here we are.
And you got this published through the hybrid publishing house, Rootstock Publishing, correct?
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
And so how did that work? I'm just kind of curious as well, is that when you put this book together, what was the process like? At one point, did you say you kind of followed, the two of you kind of followed this journey for 4 years? And at what point talk about the process between pulling all those blog entries and into making it into a memoir that kind of followed the path?
I organized the blog posts. Sky wrote about all of his experiences, but as we posted them on the blog, they weren't necessarily in chronological order. So I pulled them all out and set them in chronological order of when it happened that he was writing about. And I wrote an introduction to each year about what we focused on. And then there's his writings and a few of mine. And once he couldn't write anymore, that's when I kind of took over talking about what happened.
That blog can be still found at, and I'll put the link in the show notes, is at alzheimerscanyon.blogspot.com, correct?
Right. Yep. And the blog, of course, being a blog, has more, it has photos and pictures and more stuff than what happens in a book, but the book is more, I don't know, bookish. That's a silly thing to say. And part of it was he wrote about his personal experience about what it was like to have dementia, but he also wrote about this fantasy world of Alzheimer's Canyon, one way in, no way out. And there are 11 episodes of what happens to this guy who gets flagged off the highway down this rutted dirt road to Alzheimer's Canyon, a place he didn't really want to go to.
And how did it work for you too, is when you sat down with Rootstock, and how much editing do they have to do? Because putting in a blog, can be very raw and unedited, and just how much editing and how much did it change for those that might have followed the blog? How similar and how different are the two?
They're very similar. I was very lucky to have a wonderful editor who is actually a friend of mine. And, I had a conversation with her because, yes, the blog posts, I was Sky's editor for the blog posts. but you're right, it's a blog, and he could use all kinds of crazy punctuation and capitalization and stuff you don't put in a book. But Marisa was really good. You know, I said keep Sky's voice and do it, you know, edit it the way books are supposed to be. And she did an excellent job of maintaining his voice and getting rid of a lot of the excess that he used.
Right. Was there any conversation as and how much, you know, through that hybrid publishing model, how much say, or was there anything in there that you kind of wished you wanted to keep in that they said, well, it just really doesn't flow like that, we need to edit some sections out? Or did that conversation ever happen?
Yeah, there was some editing, partly because of copyright issues. Sky was a big fan of quoting song lyrics, and you apparently have to pay extra if you want to quote song lyrics. And there was a wonderful blog post that our daughter wrote that it was decided to not include that in the final editing, partly because it included a lot of song lyrics. She inherited her father's love of song lyrics. So no, it was fine. You know, the way it came out, it was fine. You know?
Right. And so, I mean, when your husband passed, was it always the intention of talking to him before as to publish a book on this, or is this an afterthought to say we should put this into a book form?
Well, you know, that's an interesting question. I don't think we ever talked about it blatantly. He was just so passionate about talking about the realities of having dementia. He wanted to help erase the stigma of the disease, and, you know, did that as long as he could. And then actually, he still did it in a way. In his last year, he was at the Arbors in Shelburne. And he loved being with his people finally. Anyway, no, it was always in the back of my mind, you know, given that I had written 3 other books, like, we're going to make a book out of this, because there are very, very few books written by people with dementia, as you can well imagine.
Right.
And so I wanted to add Sky's voice to that small elite group.
Right. And so, you know, with that said, how different was this process, putting this book together, as compared to you came out with Birth Stories back in '92 and Freedom Through Frugality back in 2010.
Right.
And then you also said you also had another book that you came out about your Universalist work.
Right. Yeah. Big Ideas for Small Congregations. That was in 2008. Yeah. No, I just wrote. I mean, that's like what I do. I write what I know, what I live, what I see. And then that's what Sky did. You know, he wrote what he was living and shared it with us.
Right. And how, so talk to us a little bit about that process, as you say, is like, is you decide to make the book. How did you find Rootstock Publishing? Was that something that you already identified ahead of time, or that you're familiar with, or was there some research involved?
I wasn't at all. Actually, you know, my first book, Birth Stories, was published by a major publisher, you know, because that was the early 90s. That's
right.
what the publishing world was. And for both Big Ideas for Small Congregations and Freedom Through Frugality, I pitched them to publishers, and nobody wanted the church book, which I don't blame them. It was a very niche thing. So I self-published. And I did have a contract with a publisher for Freedom Through Frugality, but we ran into a few conflicts. So I gave them back my advance and self-published that as well. And both of them did fine for being a niche market. But I knew that Alzheimer's Canyon deserved a larger audience and deserved a publisher. And I tried a bunch and finally had success with Rootstock.
is there a way, like, was there like a pitch involved, or how did that work?
No, they had a you sent them the first whatever pages, I forget how many, 30, 40 pages. And, so I did. And if I didn't get a phone call like 10 minutes later saying, yes, we want this, I'm like, okay, sign me up. Yeah. I mean, that's just what happened. It was a
Right.
pretty straightforward process.
Right. And so who would you say, like, for instance, like that Alzheimer's Canyon, obviously it's important for caregivers and maybe people that might need to learn more about Alzheimer's, but would this be also a book that would be specifically, say, it's for, say, like a general audience, or who would this book be written for?
Well, given that 6 million people in the US have dementia, this book is for everybody, because I suspect everybody either has a family member or a friend or a colleague, or will have a family member or a friend or a colleague that has dementia. It's like way too common. It's the 5th leading cause of death in the US. And so really this book is for everyone. Particularly for people with dementia who are still able to read and interested in, finding out someone else's take on what's happening. I have heard from several people who have early stage dementia who've read the book, who said Sky nailed it, that was their experience as well of what it's like to have dementia. And there's a bit of what I say in there as his wife and partner and caregiver, which is no fun, but it has to be done. It's not easy to watch your beloved and best friend kind of drift away, though he was still himself. To the end, but to watch all those skills and gifts that he had as a person kind of disappear.
Right. Yeah. And and how much of this too, like in this book, is there an expectation where there's how much of it is a, as you say, a memoir, and how much of this is based off of like more like an advocacy piece to make sure that, say, like the medical profession learns more about this? So
that would be good.
Yeah.
If the medical profession could learn more about this. My first career was as a registered nurse, and I worked the two ends of life. I ran the birthing center at Gifford in the late 70s and early 80s, and then I worked in a nursing home in a memory care unit, and then I did hospice. And, in our culture, people don't talk about end of life care. And it was a real gift that Sky was like, okay, this is what I want. And we went to the lawyer and we filled out all the papers. And when it came time, when he was dying, it was easy because I knew exactly what he wanted. And I was able to give him the death that he wanted. And, that doesn't happen to everybody.
Right. And how much have you noticed too, just from that advocacy perspective? Because now you've been living and being a part of the Alzheimer's community since 2016, so that's been 7 years. Have you seen an increase in education for the general public when it comes to Alzheimer's and other dementia-related disorders at all?
I hope so. I feel like, like 30 years ago, nobody talked about having cancer. And now it's like, oh, cancer walk, this, ribbons, like, everybody talks about cancer. And I'm hoping that that's where dementia is heading, that it's not going to be so stigmatized and so forbidden. I knitted Sky this brain hat that he wore all the time. And people would say to him, we were in Burlington, he'd be walking down the street, he liked to walk a lot, ride his bike a lot. People would say, oh, like your hat. And he'd say, let me tell you about that. I have dementia. And, and half the people would go, oh, goodbye. But then the other half would say, oh, my grandmother had that, or my brother-in-law or whoever, and they'd want to talk about it. And Sky gave them the opportunity to be able to talk about it.
Right. Yeah. And now, so and also I'm just kind of curious as well, because this book has a strong message. Is there any conversations that you're having with Rootstock or with yourself, with talking to other advocates of maybe making companion pieces to this? Any ideas of turning it into also some maybe some caregiver modules or anything along those lines?
That sounds like fun. No, nobody's talked about that yet, but I've gotten involved with the Vermont chapter of the Alzheimer's Association, and I'll be doing lobbying at the State House and stuff like that.
I mean, we mentioned before you went on the air that you're going to be going to different states and talking about the book as well.
Yeah, I am. Yes, I have engagements from Maine to California. And happy to have more if anybody wants to get in touch with me. Happy to do public speaking, readings, libraries, bookstores, whatever. And it's important to talk about this. Because it's not easy, and it's going to happen to a whole lot of people. It's already happening to a whole lot of people.
Right. And do you see this also too? Do you see that those that are interested, that seem to be coming to these talks, are they mostly a generational thing, or do you see younger folks wanting to learn more about it as well?
Yeah, it's everybody, young and old. Very interesting, and people ask a lot of good questions, and they're very concerned about this. They want to know about support groups. They want to know about finances. They want to know about end-of-life care. This is something that we don't talk about in our society, and I have to say, I don't think our doctors do real well talking about it either. So it's important. It's important to talk about it, because we're all going to die of something at some point.
Right. Yeah. And do you see, so when you're reaching out and doing these talks, is it mostly at, say, like libraries, or as you say, libraries, bookstores, or are they usually at senior centers, or who are the
most of your audience? Senior centers. It's been libraries, bookstores, and churches.
Wow. Okay.
I have a sermon that I do as well, given that I'm a retired. Besides a retired nurse, I'm a retired minister. So.
And plus too is you have books that are based off of some of your pathways. So I'm also kind of curious, in the where does freedom through frugality fit in? Is that because you're a native Vermonter and Vermonters are known as being frugal people?
Yeah, very funny. No, I think my parents were cheap more than frugal. We're children of the Depression, so what can I say? No, freedom through frugality came because Sky and I chose to retire early. In the early 90s, we read a book called Your Money or Your Life, which talked about understanding your relationship with money. And so what we decided to do was follow that program, so we that could retire early to then be able to do volunteer work. And I am forever grateful that we did that, given that Sky got diagnosed with dementia at age 66 with no family history and in perfect health otherwise. And so we had nearly 10 years of volunteering, primarily in New Orleans after Katrina, helping rebuild. And we spent our summers in France. And I was actually, the AARP magazine did a story about us. And that's when I was approached by a publisher. Oh, could you write a book about this? And so I said, sure. And anyway, long story short, the publisher and I didn't agree, and I self-published Freedom Through Frugality. It's a way to move through the world. Like, we just didn't buy things because we wanted to have our money available to us to be able to have the freedom to do other things, which is what we did.
Yeah. And so through the process of writing your latest book, The Alzheimer's Canon, what were some of the things that you're happy that you wrote previous books, so you already knew from that publishing and writing perspective that you didn't have to learn already?
Right. I mean, I knew how to create a document. I mean, I remember sending off the manuscript for my first book. This was 91.
92, 91, right?
Well, it
Yeah.
came out in 92, but it was 91. And it was like paper that you printed in a box that you sent off, you know, and now it's all online and email and, you know, PDF
Right.
or whatever, you know. So, no, I felt like I had been around the block on this book thing, so it wasn't a big deal.
And so, and through the Alzheimer's Canyon, talking about that again, is that you had you know, looking at the blog post that happened, how much of the book itself is not in the blog?
All of my yearly, you know, all my introductions. I wrote a general introduction explaining who we were and our life.
Right.
And then I divided the blog posts into years. And so it was for 4.5 years. So it's like 5 years. So I wrote an introduction to each year. And then I wrote an epilogue. And then I wrote a thing that I called Jane and Sky's Helpful Hints. Should you or one of your loved ones be diagnosed with dementia, the things that we found important. So, yeah. So, no, the book has a lot of stuff that's not on the blog.
Now, did you, and I'm really curious because as this was happening, you had COVID during this time as well. Did you talk about that at all in Alzheimer's Canyon?
Yeah, way. No, who knows how this would have gone had we not had COVID. But starting in February of 2019, Sky started having hallucinations, and he started having them with greater and greater frequency, so that by the winter, like by December of 2019 and January of 2020, I was not sleeping because he was up and down all night long with this hallucination or that hallucination, and they were by and large benign. But they would wake me up. Well, he would wake me up. He'd want to tell me about like this thing that was happening that wasn't really happening. And he would go back to sleep and I wouldn't. And I was not doing well with not sleeping. I didn't do well when we had little babies. And thank goodness he was the one who got up and walked them in the middle of the night. Anyway, the Arbors, the memory care facility in Shelburne, offers a respite program where people can stay for 2 weeks to 2 months to give the family a break. And so Sky and I talked about that in January of 2020. And then in February, we went for a tour. We spent a day and he went to activities and we had lunch and talked to the staff members and stuff. And he agreed to go for a time of respite so I could have a break. And I was like, oh man, I had visions of a beach on an ocean with warm water and fruity cocktails and trashy novels and lots of sleeping while he was well cared for at the Arbors. And so we signed up and I placed him there on March 10th, 2020. And then we know what happened next.
Right.
There was, you know, the plan was for him to be there for 2 weeks. And by the time I placed him, I'm like, no Caribbean beach. I can't even go to New York City and go to the theater. Like this weird thing is happening. And then the lockdown happened. And I wasn't even allowed to see him until the end of June. It was really awful. But that was, the governor had a lockdown, and especially for senior care facilities.
Right.
So, you know, we talked on the phone. But the first time to be able to see him after all those months, it was 6 feet apart, masked and gowned outside for a half an hour once a week.
Wow.
And it didn't go well because someone with dementia doesn't understand the masks and gowns and the 6 feet apart. Like he couldn't even see me because at that point he couldn't hold his head up. And so he was staring at the ground. I mean, he knew it was me. He knew my voice. But it was so frustrating to not be
Right.
able to touch him, sit next to him, you know.
Yeah.
It was pretty awful. And I kept trying to decide whether I wanted to keep doing that or not, but I did.
Yeah.
And then by fall, we had another lockdown. So we went back to being on Zoom, which doesn't also go over well with someone with dementia.
Right.
Or the phone was better.
Yeah. And in what level, coming from a caregiver and a loved one, what level of advocacy would you, recommend for medical establishments like that for something that might happen again, similar in the future?
Well, we were really lucky with the Arbors because they were amazing and fabulous, and bless their hearts, I don't know how they did it in the pandemic without the help from family members. When we came on our day when we had the tour, there were family members all over the place. They were helping to feed people and walking with people, sitting with people, and I'm like, oh my God, the staff had to pull this off all by themselves. They did
Right.
a great job. But I'm also familiar with other senior facilities in the state, and they're not all as good as the Arbors.
Right.
The too many people, and I have to say I remember this from the facility that I worked in, but this was in the 80s. You just parked people by the nurses station and hoped for the best. Like there
Right.
weren't activities, there was some music maybe and stuff, but people were not respected as whole people, even though they had dementia, because they are still whole people.
Mm-hmm.
So there really needs to be some work around that, and I have to say most of it's financial.
Right.
Like to be able to train staff, either facility staff or home care staff, in how to deal with people with dementia, because you don't argue with them, you don't try to straighten them out, you go with the flow. It's like theater improv. You just like, yeah, wherever you're going, I'm going with you, unless it's not safe. Then you have to redirect somebody, but otherwise you have to just kind of go with the flow.
Well, you bring up a good point. Do you feel as though it's like would your book also help out in in a situation of making sure people are trained in how to work with someone with dementia, like some sort of specialty certification or something along those lines? Is there an educational aspect to the book as well?
That's a good question. I think that would depend on the person reading it. I would like to think people reading it would get educated, that to understand that people with dementia are whole people who have lives, and they may be doing things that like you and I don't do. But like Sky had this whole, in his hallucinatory world, he had a relationship with the natural world, like with trees and flowers, and they had names and they talked to him, and like that's completely amazing. Like, is there some level of consciousness that you and I don't know about?
Right.
And so for professionals to be able to understand that people with dementia have like a whole life that should be respected for what it is, and not like, oh no, the trees don't talk. But like, wait a minute, maybe they do, and we just don't know.
Right. Yeah. But and so where do you see? So what are your hopes moving forward? With the book, because it's an evergreen book. It's not necessarily a book that is specific. That this book can be read 10 years from now.
Right.
What are your hopes? Where do you see your book, and where do you see your role in as an author and advocate for Alzheimer's right now?
Well, first I want to make Sky famous. That's the most important thing. Because there are so few books written by people with dementia, and he clung to the ones, the couple that really spoke to him. And so I'm hoping this is true for other people, that this book will bring people with dementia some comfort to know that this diagnosis, as horrible as it is, it's not the end of the world. But you can still have a really good life even with dementia. Um, and I feel like that's my role, is to get that word out.
Right. And do you see anything? I realized the book just the book came out. As of this recording, the book came out 2 months ago.
Right.
Is there any other conversations that you're having on trying to do other supplements to this, or adding? Was there anything that was cut out, or anything that you want to add on to it, or putting into another sequel book to this, or anything around those lines?
Well, no, there's been no conversation about that. It's doing, I've been on the road with this, right? The book came out November 1st. So I've been on the road doing stuff since then. And I'm booked, pretty much through May. And doing this work is amazing. And it's also emotionally wrenching. Like, this is my husband who died. And sometimes I don't want to talk about it so much, it's tough. And so I'm excited about being part of the work in the legislature this year. Hopefully we can get some bills passed. There's they want to get a Vermont dementia coordinator, which would be amazing, because that would help professionals as well as advocate for families. So that's kind of what I'm doing now.
Right. What advice would you give authors who publish an incredibly personal book, and what advice would you give them, moving forward, and what would you tell them?
Self-publishing is fine if you have a niche market, but God forbid, if you self-publish, do hire an editor and a graphic designer. I have read too many people who are like, oh, I'm just going to do this thing on Amazon, and you can't even read it because it's not been edited. Take the time to make it good. And I wasn't familiar with this hybrid publishing thing. And so that has its positive aspects, because with the hybrid publishing, it's basically like you're self-publishing, but the publisher deals with all the publicity and the marketing and getting in with the book distribution people, which I don't completely understand. So it's worth paying somebody to do that for you. And this seems to be the new wave, unless you're Prince Harry or somebody famous who gets a $40 million contract.
And he didn't even write it. He had a ghostwriter too.
Of course he must have, and he hardly needs $40 million. Think of what you and I could do with $40 million. Anyway, yeah, the publishing world is, it's like a completely different animal than it was 30 years ago when my first book came out. And my first book is still in print, which still blows my mind. But anyway, the publishing world, yeah. But yeah,
good. And so, what other advice would you give somebody that might be writing a book that has a memoir that has a lot of personal stories in it?
That it's if it gets published and you have to do publicity for it, it's an emotionally wrenching experience.
Right.
It's really, really hard, and it's also really, really great at the same time. It's a very strange experience, because my other books were personal, but they weren't personal like this.
Right.
So this is tough.
Well, so Jane, if people want to buy the book, where's the best place they could go?
Well, I like people to go to their local bookstore, wherever your local bookstore is. And worst comes to worst, you can buy it from Amazon. You can also go on my website, janedwinell.com, and buy it from me, or you can go on Rootstock Publishing's website and buy it from them.
Right.
But
there you go.
And please ask your library to get a copy.
That's a good point. Yeah. So please go to your local library and ask them for ask them to see if they can order
Yeah.
a copy.
Completely, because it should be accessible to everyone, whether or not you buy books.
If people want to learn more about you, as you said, they can go to Dwinell.com, correct?
Right.
And that is GANEDWINELL.com. And we'll add that to the show notes for those that want to click on the button and see that in the show notes for our listeners. I look forward to probably seeing you on the Capitol. Probably.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.